First, let me explain what the Cuban Missile Crisis was. The Cuban Missile Crisis took place at the height of the Cold War, during the month of October 1962. It was a tense standoff between the world's two atomic superpowers, the United States and the Soviet Union, that lasted 13 days and brought the world to the edge of nuclear war. It started on October 14, 1962, when an American spy plane took photographs of Soviet ballistic missiles being installed into Cuba. The missiles were equipped with nuclear warheads and capable of hitting the United States and Canada. On October 16, 1962, John F. Kennedy, the American president at the time, was informed about the situation and spent a week discussing with his advisors what action to take. He ignored his military, who were insisting to launch airstrikes at the missile sites in Cuba. Instead, on live television, Kennedy announced the crisis and an immediate naval blockade around Cuba to quarantine the country on October 22, 1962. Canada's Prime Minister at the time was John Diefenbaker, who was Canada's leader from 1957 until 1963. Diefenbaker and Kennedy had a rocky relationship. When Kennedy had came to Ottawa in 1961 to discuss with Diefenbaker about Canada housing nuclear weapons north of the border, Diefenbaker and Kennedy were getting along just fine. Until the Rostov memo was left behind by the Americans and fell into Diefenbaker's hands. It had information about the Ottawa meeting and where Kennedy should push Diefenbaker. Instead of returning the memo, which is diplomatic etiquette, Diefenbaker secretly kept the memo, and when the US government later found out, they were infuriated. The last straw that broke the relationship was on April 29, 1962, when Kennedy invited the Canadian Liberal leader, Lester B. Pearson, Diefenbaker's opposition, to the White House just 6 weeks before the Canadian election. Diefenbaker thought Kennedy was trying to overthrow him, and that is about where the relationship fell apart.
For him to do that, and it became personal with me.
During the Cuban Missile Crisis, Kennedy informed Diefenbaker of the crisis just before the television broadcast on October 22nd. Diefenbaker was angry at Kennedy for not informing him earlier and thought it was personal. He wanted to see more evidence of what exactly was happening in Cuba and urged Kennedy to send United Nations inspectors to Cuba to verify the situation. The main issue that Kennedy had was when he asked Diefenbaker to raise the alert level of Canadian military troops to DEFCON 3. Diefenbaker was reluctant. With DEFCON 3, it means that the military is in a sense of high caution. Diefenbaker did not alert the troops. Diefenbaker did this because he thought Kennedy told him late because it was a personal slight. This clouded his judgment, and if not for Douglas Harkness, he may have never supported the naval blockade around Cuba. While the Canadian government was debating whether to raise to DEFCON 3 or to not alert their troops, Canadian Minister of Defense Douglas Harkness and Maritime Commander Admiral Kenneth Dyer defied Diefenbaker. Without government permission, Harkness raised Canada's security alert, while Admiral Dyer increased the number of surveillance patrols. While Diefenbaker was skeptical of the whole situation, Harkness believed that due to the nature of the crisis and international treaties, action needed to be taken. He was right. During one of the unauthorized patrols, the Canadian fleet discovered a Soviet submarine just 500 miles from Halifax. This discovery was enough to convince Diefenbaker of the Soviet Union's threat and of how severe the situation was getting, and eventually, on October 24, 1962, his government officially authorized DEFCON 3 and agreed to the naval blockade around Cuba. Canadian maritime forces were deployed and actively helped monitor North American waters to make sure there were no Soviet submarines within striking distance to send missiles at major American cities. Although Diefenbaker eventually supported the blockade, his hesitancy was unprofessional, and if not for Harkness and Dyer and their discovery of the Soviet submarine, Diefenbaker may have never supported the blockade, and that could have seriously put the country in more danger than it already was from the threat of the Cuban missiles, as they would have been oblivious to many of the submarines around Canada. Diefenbaker's approach to the Cuban Missile Crisis was unintelligent, as his arrogance nearly got the better of him. If Canada had stuck with Diefenbaker's approach, the Cuban Missile Crisis most likely would have looked very different, and not in the good way. Fortunately, the Cuban Missile Crisis ended on October 28, 1962, with the help of American diplomats, specifically Robert F. Kennedy, who convinced Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev to dismantle the missiles in Cuba. America promised not to invade Cuba, but would secretly withdraw the missiles they had installed in Turkey earlier in the Cold War. Diefenbaker's approach during the Cuban Missile Crisis did reflect one major thing. He wanted Canada to show their independence. Although the government wanted to maintain balance in the time of the crisis, Diefenbaker's government was criticized across Canada for their hesitancy during the Cuban Missile Crisis. Diefenbaker had won his first election with the biggest landslide in Canadian history, but after the mishandling of the Cuban Missile Crisis, the US government accused the Diefenbaker government of lying and avoiding their military duties. Harkness resigned, and after a vote of non-confidence was triggered, Diefenbaker lost the 1963 election to Lester B. Pearson and the Liberal Party. His approach to the Cuban Missile Crisis was, in the end, his ultimate downfall. Although the Diefenbaker government did not approach the Cuban Missile Crisis the best way, Canada and the rest of the world did get out unscathed. But what if it were different? What if the Cuban Missile Crisis went south and ended in catastrophe? The Cuban Missile Crisis was one misstep, one miscommunication, one fail of diplomacy from an all-out nuclear war, and that would have meant one thing: destruction. The most likely point of nuclear outbreak is when U.S. destroyer ships USS Beale and USS Coney dropped signaling depth charges on a Soviet submarine. If the captain of the sub did not listen to his level-headed officer, the submarine, which was carrying a 15-kiloton nuke, would have most likely fired at the U.S. aircraft carrier Randolph and its surrounding ships, sinking Randolph and damaging the nearby ships. This would have resulted in at least 3,000 dead sailors and mariners. The most likely response from the US will be Air Force sorties onto the missile sites in Cuba, but with not enough sorties ready before Soviet response, 24 of the 36 missile sites in Cuba would have survived. To prevent the use of the rest of the missiles, the US would have gone for a ground assault. Their projections showed that there were only 10,000 to 12,000 Soviet troops and no tactical nukes. They would have brought 180,000 troops to invade Cuba. With new research, there were realistically about 40,000 Soviet troops and 92 tactical nukes on the island. The US troops would have been absolutely obliterated, nearly losing all 180,000 of their troops, as well as any Marines that were still nearby. The United States would be stunned and overcome with rage. At this point, both sides would be brought into a full-fledged nuclear war. The Soviets, who were at a big disadvantage in terms of total nuclear weapons, would try to strike first, while the Americans would launch devastating amounts of nuclear weaponry at the Soviet Union. The result? Global catastrophe. The remaining 24 missile sites in Cuba would get at least a few missiles out before the sites and the rest of Cuba were destroyed by the US. The missiles, which had a 1 megaton nuclear warhead on them each, would have been sent to Washington, D.C. and hit cities in the southeast United States. The Soviet Union on its own would have been demolished from the sheer number of missiles raining down from the US. Chunks of China and nearby European countries would have been damaged as well. After it was all said and done, America would have won the exchange wildly, but chunks of North America would be hit hard as well. The casualties on all sides would be in the tens, if not hundreds of millions. As devastating as those numbers sound, the ripple effect would have been much deeper. While the countries that were hit may partially recover, the after effects of the nuclear exchange would reshape the world altogether. When the bombs were dropped, the radiation would have killed most that were even many kilometers away from the bombs. The fallout would have left vast swaths of countries plagued with radiation. This would result in chunks of countries uninhabitable. Even the countries that would have limited radioactive fallout, cancers, birth defects, and other health implications would be a major issue over time. We know this because this already happened in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. For the countries that were hit hard with lots of radiation, they might experience a multitude of after effects, one being black rain from airborne particles. EMPs are also a huge after effect. When nuclear bombs detonate, they cut electricity from nearby areas. By disabling electronics and their functioning, an EMP would disable hospitals, water treatment facilities, food storage facilities, and all electronic forms of communication, although some countries such as the US may have had backup plans to counter this. The two scariest after effects, however, that could have taken place are nuclear winter and nuclear famine. With nuclear winter, leftover soot and smoke gets carried to high altitudes and starts to block out major amounts of sunlight. This would lead to health effects as well as nuclear famine. Because of the reduction of sunlight, global farming would be significantly damaged. Hundreds of millions of people would now also be in danger from mass starvation, especially in poor countries. When I mean this could have been catastrophe, I mean catastrophe. Fortunately, all the right pieces fell together, and good approach or not, Diefenbaker and the United States did manage to avoid global devastation, and I say that is still a win. This topic is important because it talks about how although Canada showed their independence, it did not mean that it was the best approach. Arrogance and strength are not the same thing, and although I think that got the best of Diefenbaker, he did take part in stopping a global disaster, and we need to know what could have happened, because if we do not, then history may repeat itself, and trust me, we do not want that.